So for the next conversation, let me bring up to the stage experts on a topic that affects all of us, and that is cybersecurity. We have three experts. My good friend David Sanger from the New York Times is here, national security correspondent. He is also the author of a fascinating, best-selling new book called The Perfect Weapon, so come on up. We also have Shane Huntley, director of Google's Threat Analysis Group, who's with us, and Sherry Ramsey, former head of the NSA's Threat Operations Center. So come up. And as they get seated, applause. David has a fascinating piece in the Times that you should read tonight if you have not read it yet, this morning. And a little bit of it here. A new Cold War has begun between the US and Russia, has begun to emerge with China playing a key role. Another great piece. Good to see you. I'll see you guys in a few minutes.
Well, thank you, Poppy, and thank you to both Shane and Sherry for joining us. It was great to hear the conversation with Lyft, and it was a really inspiring morning we've had about the breadth of ways that the computing world, the technology world, artificial intelligence, quantum computing is bringing all kinds of new possibilities to us. As a reporter, I've always been struck by the fact that when the internet first began to take off, the initial thought of politicians and many people who worked at NGOs, many people who lived around the world, was that this would be a great democratizing force. I was White House correspondent for the Times during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and Bill Clinton would go to China, go to Beijing University, and usually give a speech that basically says the Communist Party of China is toast after the world began to be exposed to the kind of information flows that the internet made possible. Today, we view that very differently. The high point of that thinking was probably the Arab Spring, when we saw protests organized on Tahrir Square and other places by young people who were using Twitter and Facebook and Google products and many others to go organize rallies that ultimately brought down a government in Egypt and other governments around the Middle East. What we've seen in the past 5 years has been a huge authoritarian backlash. The use of the web as an instrument of control, the emergence of trolls to intimidate people. Far more than just surveillance, we have now seen the rise of all kinds of influence operations. We have seen the rise of cyber attacks. When I wrote a book 6 years ago called Confront and Conceal that revealed the American attacks and the presidential decision-making that went into the American attacks on Iran's nuclear centrifuges, it was hard to find another sophisticated cyber attack mounted by one nation against another. There were denial of service attacks, there were modest attacks in Estonia, but there was nothing of the incredible sophistication of what we knew as Stuxnet and what the government called Operation Olympic Games against Iran. As I worked on The Perfect Weapon, the book that Poppy referred to, my research assistants stopped counting on state-on-state sophisticated attacks when they hit 200 or 250. And those were just in the past 6 years, and those were just the ones we knew about. So that gives you a sense of how quickly cyber has emerged as the weapon of choice for states that want to conduct short-of-war operations and not bring about a military result. The two folks up here on the stage with me today have seen the rise of this phenomenon and the struggle to come up with a way to deter attacks, the way to be resilient against attacks, and the way to counter attacks really closely. Sherry, as you heard before, ran the NTOC, the NSA's Threat Operations Center, which looks a little bit, when you step inside it, like you've just gone onto a movie set. It's quite cool. They let me in on rare occasion, only rare occasion, Sherry. Shane, of course, is the director of Google's Threat Analysis Group, and he's the one who works to detect and analyze and disrupt serious and state-run threats. I call Shane, with no offense to Sherry's colleagues, before I call the NSA to figure out what's going on, because Google's networks are such, and I would say the same for Microsoft and for Facebook and so forth, that they frequently see this stuff before the US government does. So, Shane, let me start with you, since the elections are so close and we spent some time discussing those earlier today. We've now seen the Director of National Intelligence come out with a statement just a day or so ago that basically said, we continue to be concerned about influence operations from Russia, China, and other countries, especially Iran, but we don't see a whole lot of threat right now to the actual election infrastructure, that is, the voting machines, the registration systems, and so forth. Tell us what you're seeing.
So, as soon as somebody finds out what I do for a living, then all through this year, I think I spent a significant fraction of this year answering this question. So, what are you seeing with regards to the elections? And the answer really is surprisingly little on the hacking front, at least. And that reassures some people and it scares some people. It really depends whether you're a half-glass full sort of person. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Like, compare back to 2016 when we were in the thick of it and there was, very few people working on this, but like a lot of high consequence. Like this time in 2016, the DNC had been hacked. There was like mailboxes from like key figures on the, websites that were, probably run by the Russians, like DCLeaks.com or through WikiLeaks. And, I was sitting at home in the presidential debate as like one of the topics is they're discussing emails that had been leaked, that had been hacked, and it was actually driving some of the debates from like then candidate Trump. We really, went into this year with this high preparation at the start of the year of like, I told my team, it's like, we've got a lot of goals, but goal number one is 2018 doesn't look like 2016. And I don't think it's because of us, but we have been doing some good work. But we really surprisingly haven't been seeing on the hacking side that sort of targeting towards elections with some very, very small exceptions. So two obvious like follow-on questions is that because I'm just not good at it and I can't find it? Or is it because there is actually less of this activity? I really want to believe the latter, and I've got some good reasons why I think that's actually true. And that's because it's not just us. I talk to everybody out there, and I ask this question of everybody I know, whether in the government or other companies or you name it. If somebody knows something, I want to know about it, and I know a lot of people. And they're not seeing a lot either with regards to direct targeting. And the other reason is, that I'm not sure what it would look like anyway. And I think it's like fighting the last war. I went to military academy in like the mid-90s, and pretty much all my military training was about how every war is going to look like the first Gulf War from here on out. And guess what? They didn't. And I think 2018 is a different year to 2016, and there's a real argument to be made that, if the goal at that time was to create a world where there was less faith in the democratic institutions, that we were a divided country, that there was hyper-partisanism, and it was like driving a wedge between the different sides of the democracy, one might say there's not a lot of hacking that needs to happen at this current point to actually engender that because we're already here.
Well, Sherry, you're not so long out of the NSA, which was looking for all of these things, and yet 2 years ago, by the admission of the directors of national intelligence at the time and the CIA director and others, we were caught pretty flat-footed. It took a long time for the intelligence community to recognize what was happening and then debating at great length whether or not to blame Vladimir Putin by name, trying to find the intelligence that would have indicated that he ordered this. Ultimately, they got there, but it took them a long time. So what surprised you about the 2016 cycle? And is anything surprising that we're seeing it very differently in 2018?
So I guess I was not surprised at the 2016 cycle. And I guess I would want to say the way that NSA works is we respond to requirements. NSA doesn't go off on its own and just, make its own requirements to look for those kinds of things. As well as, like Google, looks at the networks in the US, and the intelligence community, specifically NSA, does not have the latitude to do that. And so that perhaps, legally, yes.
This may not be known to everybody in there, but despite all you read, the NSA cannot do domestic spying.
That's correct.
And that means it can't look inside domestic networks.
That's correct. So I think from, NSA was probably not surprised, and the rest of the intelligence community, given what we knew about Putin, about the state of Russia, about what they were attempting to do. As far as the specifics, I believe that's probably why we were not as well involved as Google and others, Facebook and others, on what was happening. I think that we should be extremely cautious and looking out there, as I know we all are, because I think the rest of the world really looked sort of with great interest at what we now all accept as Russia was able to accomplish, if you will, in the last election. I think, there are other countries out there that looked at what happened, that looked at what it caused to happen, looked at what we're doing now, and they're saying, well, maybe that would be a path for us. I think the really interesting thing about this particular situation, specifically in cyber is what we call asymmetric. And that is, you don't have to be a Putin, you don't have to be a Russia, you don't have to be a China necessarily in order to create these effects. In the past, when we first started to talk about cyber and cyber attacks, pretty much we assumed that the attacks would be coming from nation states. And so I think most of our thinking was, how do we interact with other nation states in terms of perhaps trying to set norms, in terms of, what is the playing field like? I think what we are now seeing is that even with lesser nation states who never thought they could take on the U.S., one-on-one, have now seen that they now have the ability to do that in the cyber world. I think the thing that scares me even more is that this provides, now we have the opportunity for others, activist groups, any kind of group, terrorist groups, criminal groups, even, high school kids. There is the opportunity now for them to wreak some of this havoc themselves. And so when we try to talk about how do we come to norms, how do we do this, my question would be, who do we even bring to the table? How do we do that? This whole nature of the asymmetric nature of cyber has made that extremely difficult. And those are the wild cards. Even if we can get to some sort of norms with the nation states, then you've got these other wild cards as to how do they interact. They don't play by the same rules necessarily. So I think that in the future, we not only have to be concerned about the Russias, the Chinas, and what they can accomplish, but also other countries that we would never have seen as a viable one-on-one opponent to us, but then also these other wild cards out there who may see their chance to step up and disrupt our democracy.
That's what we're seeing. So that's sorry.
Go right ahead.
I was saying that's what we're seeing in in a very clear way, is that the capabilities are coming down to these to the actors, and they're even being sold by these companies that are providing cyber capabilities in a box to repressive regimes. We saw this when one of the Egyptian governments fell. We even saw the invoices, and it was like hundreds of thousands of euros is all it took to buy a cyber capability off the shelf. Like, if you're a dictator, you may not have the billions of dollars and launch capabilities to put up a spy satellite, but you can buy a hacking capability for if you can buy for hundreds of thousands of euros, some of these dictators probably spend more money gold-plating their bathrooms than they do buying these capabilities.
Well, I remind people that to build nuclear weapons, you need uranium, plutonium, several $1 million, maybe billions of dollars, big infrastructure. To build cyber weapons, you need some teenagers, some 20-somethings, a few folks in this room, maybe a little stolen code from the NSA, because there's a lot of that floating around right now, and a case of Red Bull, and you're good,
Absolutely. And by the way, it is very clear, and I think Google has, and others have seen evidence of this, is that is very real. It is happening. It's happening daily. The bad guys, whether they be nation states, criminals, high school kids, on the dark web and other places, they collaborate. They actually do collaborate together. And actually, some of these attacks are being sold for hundreds of thousands of euros, but some are not. They're hundreds of dollars. and quite inexpensive. And then you have those actors out there who, if a person is, if they can buy an attack, but they're not perhaps qualified, although I understand some of them even come with instructions, and they teach them how to do it. They'll even you can even borrow someone else's infrastructure or rent it, I guess. You can actually hire one of these, maybe someone who's a member of the PLA, or maybe somebody who's in Russia, works for the GRU, or someone in Russia, or maybe just a high school kid. You can hire them to execute it for you.
Well, I guess it's good to know that the old values of collaboration aren't completely gone. Shane, before we turn to issues of hacking apart from the election, I wanted to ask you about one word that's in that DNI report. They keep naming Iran. So in 2016, we were worried about Russia. President Trump has raised China, although the more you press the White House, that doesn't seem to be on the cyber side quite as much for election interference. But Iran, they keep naming as a potential election interferer using cyber and influence operations. Are you seeing that?
To a certain degree, yes. Not nearly to the extent as like some of the other major tech companies, but we all published, a few months ago that we were seeing these sort of activities coming from Iran. And what was most striking is that they were playing sort of directly out of Russia's playbook here that we saw with their internet research agency. I kind of dislike the disinformation side, as I said, kind of because it's just hard. Like, one is that hacking's kind of nice because you're either hacking or you're not hacking. Disinformation's hard because if you're posting a video to YouTube about Black Lives Matter, if you're Black Lives Matter Atlanta, then you're in the political process. If you're in the, Iranian state media, or you're in the, Russia and St. Petersburg, and then you're pretending to be Americans, you're probably not. So there's this whole disinformation side. So what we saw with Iran to a certain degree, I think it was 39 YouTube videos was the extent with a small number of views, is that they were playing that game. They were pretending to be Americans or hiding who they were and having this coordinated activity which looked like it was there to engage in our political debate. And that's the big change that we've made as companies, is that we actually sort of understand this more and are defining these policies that that's not okay. You can't, hide who you are, pretend to be American, have this coordinated political activity and operate on our platforms. That's against our terms of service. So we're hunting out that activity and we're taking it down when we find it.
I would just remind all of you on your geopolitical calendars, the date for the next American sanctions, the full American sanctions on Iran to go into effect, the ones that are designed to cut off all of their oil revenue, whether it works or not, is November 4th, and the election day is November 6th. So if we were here prior to the 2016 election, we would be talking about vulnerabilities that are different than the election system. We'd be talking about the power grid, right? Everybody's favorite. We would be talking about communication systems, all of the other kind of vulnerabilities. And when you think about the different categories of hacking that we have seen by states in particular, there's traditional espionage. There's data manipulation, which is what we worry about in the election space, but also what we worry about if somebody, for example, stepped in and changed all the blood types in the military's database. There are attacks on infrastructure, such as what the U.S. did to Iran, or what it did, as we've reported, to the North Korean missile tests. And then there's information warfare. So, Sherry, as you look at those, which of those categories worries you the most? I assume not espionage, because we've all seen that since people were opening letters and listening to phone calls. I assume it's somewhere in the space between subtle data manipulation and attacks on infrastructure. But
actually, I do stay awake at night worrying about all of those things. I think we have seen a decline somewhat in the espionage piece, particularly maybe from China. But what still worries me is when I look at us as a country, I think the greatest thing that we have to offer is our intellectual property. And so the fact that there are a number of entities, I'll say, because I think it's spread far beyond nation states now for many reasons. There are still many entities out there who are looking to conduct espionage via cyber attacks to get at our intellectual property. And I think that that's very scary. And you know, an example that's happened over the last 10 years, I still think there are going to be some examples, is the Joint Strike Fighter, that we spent lots of money and billions of dollars and lots of time investing in developing our Joint Strike Fighter. Interestingly enough, there is another country who ended up building an airplane that looked a lot like the Joint Strike Fighter, and quite frankly, fielded it faster than we did. And you know, if you think about it,
building it as selling it at a third of the price.
Absolutely,
yes.
and
right.
selling it to many others. So, you know, that is the kind of thing that does keep me up at night, and I do think that will continue to happen, not just in the government space, but also in the industry space, because you know, if you look at the drug manufacturers and all kinds of things like that, the pharmaceutical companies, there's still a lot of intellectual property out there that you know, that I think people would consider valuable. I do worry a lot about the sabotage. You know, clearly we've seen evidences when that happens. If you go back and look at Saudi Arabia, when someone came in and basically bricked 35,000 of their laptops, they basically shut down this company who produced 10% of the world's oil. And you think, oh, well, that was just 10%. But what did the price of oil immediately do? It jumped up globally. But then you don't think about the second and third order effects that really actually ended up affecting us. What that company particularly did was they went out and they said, okay, we have to go buy chips, new chips. They went to the chip manufacturers and they said, we want 35,000 new chips. Well, guess what? There weren't 35,000 new chips available. And so they said, we'll pay you double the price for them. Give us the ones you have. So basically what that did long-term was, if you and I were sitting there waiting for a computer, there was a shortage of them because there were no chips to put in them. And when there eventually became computers, they cost more because the chips cost more. Guess what? The chip manufacturers didn't say, okay, this was a one-time thing. They saw the demand for that and they left the price up high. So you really have to think about, in terms of the sabotage, there are these second and third order effects which do affect us, even if that sabotage is in a country, you know, around the world.
I'd also say that espionage really does matter as well, and espionage not just against nations but against individuals.
Right.
And a lot of what my team deals with, a lot of the most vulnerable communities, the people who are trying to do good in the world, the activists, the vulnerable populations, they're on platforms like Gmail, and them getting hacked by their local repressive regime or their opponents literally puts their lives at risk. That LGBT activist in the Middle East, their account security is also their physical security. We identify, and this isn't rare activity from states, we're warning around 4,000 Gmail users every month that some state has been targeting them in some way. So this is a day in, day out, low-level thing that people have to deal with, and we're trying to protect. We want them to protect themselves, but we need to come together and counter this. Espionage matters.
You know, I have to tell you that it won't surprise anybody in this room, given my job, that I would periodically get that big red banner across my Gmail, my personal Gmail, that said, a state sponsor is trying to get into, right? So I call Shane up, and he says, oh, yeah. He said, I designed that red banner. I said, thanks. Let me ask you the reverse side of this. So we tend to feel a lot as if we are all victims, the collateral damage in what's going on here. But the fact of the matter is the United States runs big offensive operations. Its Five Eyes partners, including the one, Shane, that you used to work for, also run such operations. The Iran operation and North Korean one I discussed are not the only ones. And the result of this is we've wrapped a huge amount of secrecy around our own cyber capabilities and around the capabilities to detect what's coming, to protect sources and methods. What strikes me the most as a reporter in this space is that the secrecy that we've wrapped around it is so excessive that we haven't actually managed to have a good public debate about what kind of cyber operations we feel comfortable the United States to be running, and therefore what standards for things that should be off limits. Shane, why is this? Why, at this late stage, 20 years into this revolution, do we still have intelligence agencies that believe they cannot acknowledge American operations, European operations, Asian operations?
I think some of it's just habit going all the way back to the Enigma days, that we're seeing that that's the culture they brought up in with the kind of cryptography and that sort of world, that secrecy just like runs deep. But I 100% agree, it's holding us back. Like, I think industry is actually in many cases doing so much more because we aren't tying ourselves in knots with secrecy to actually stop this. And I think the other debate is the kind of mix of the offensive and defensive operations in the same agencies and not being willing to give up anything is actually, hindering us in a long way. I think all the generals have the dreams that they're going to have these, amazing cyber operations and it's going to be how we're going to win. But if you think about it, like Olympics Games was really the outlier of a somewhat successful operation, and your book points out there's not a lot of great wins otherwise in Cyber Command we know of. But, and the vulnerability we have at the moment, to me, I've kind of said that, all these talks for these offensive cyber capabilities and building it seems like people living in glass houses, like trying to ramp up a stone throwing contest. Like, we really have, in some ways, more to lose than gain in many places. So I do think we actually have to make some real trade-offs. We have to, whether it's a digital Geneva Convention or whatever, say we're going to actually draw some lines about what we in the West are not willing to do, and that we're going to hold other people to account. Knowing it's not it's perfect, knowing we're not always going to have verification, knowing that people are going to break it, but we can at least start to have some norms the same way we have with other areas.
Well, Sherry, suppose for a moment, take Shane's thought here. Suppose for a moment the Secretary of State distributed a memo next week that said, to my colleagues in the U.S. government, we need to have some kind of norms, even if they're not a full treaty. So I'm about to go negotiate with the Russians and the Chinese to take election systems off the list of acceptable things to attack, to take electric power grids off the list of things to attack, to take hospitals and nursing homes and emergency communication systems. I'm betting that by the time that hit your old offices, everybody inside would freak out. They would say, wait a minute, we had something called Nitro Zeus to unplug all of Iran if we went to war with them. We might want to mess with election systems again, as we did in the 40s and 50s, if it's a better option for a president than going to war with a country.
So I think traditionally that is probably absolutely the case. I think you're exactly right in terms of, the intelligence community has been shrouded in secrecy since its inception. And so I think, it is very difficult. We're talking about a culture change here. I think there were certain events that actually drug NSA and the rest of the intelligence community out in the forefront, even though they didn't want to, absolutely. And so I think...
Was that a good or bad thing that it drug... Whether Snowden's a good or bad thing, was the fact that it dragged them out a good thing?
I think in this day and age, I think yes. I think there needed to be more public engagement. I still think there needs to be more public engagement, more understanding of what NSA does, the constraints under which they do it, the laws that we take very seriously. And I think had there been that dialogue before, I think Snowden would have been way less of an impact, would have caused way less questions. I think that the leaders of the intelligence community, and I will speak particularly to the new NSA director and the cyber commander, whom I know very well. I think he recognizes that we have to do things differently. And quite frankly, my personal opinion, and I have not talked to him about it, so this is Sherry's opinion, is that he would vote to engage in such dialogue. And I believe that he would be very supportive of that, and understanding that where we are today, I do not believe we can continue to go forward from where we are today without making some sort of pretty radical change, and not just within the U.S., but globally. And so I think he would support efforts that would do that.
So far, he's been pretty quiet, but I agree, knowing him, I think he will. We have time for just a couple of questions before we head out of your way here. Anybody have something that is urgent on their mind? Jim.
So David, like you, I have gotten the red banner on my Gmail after working in China 4 times. Like David, I've gotten the red banner on my Gmail while working in China. Thank you for that. And I've used the Google Advanced Protection System. Who should be using Advanced Protection?
Ideally, everyone. So there's actually a standout there, and you should take a good look. So really, I think if you want to protect yourself, you're going to have to take a few more actions. And one of those actions is to do something where you actually have like a physical token to log in versus just having a password. The Russians, the Iranians, you name them, they're pretty good at tricking people for their passwords. We do the test internally. You can trick a Google security engineer for their password. You can probably trick me for the password, and I know this stuff. So the security keys, these extra mechanisms really work. So advanced protection is a system where we turn all the protections up to 11 without trying to cause you as the minimal sort of, inconvenience possible. But if you're important enough to get invited to Zeitgeist, you're probably important enough to be a target enough that you should be looking at options like that.
That's a good way to go put it.
I think one of the things we should do, kind of to follow on to what Shane said, is I think all of us really need to inform ourselves of what's going on out there, and there are many protections. Some of them are just common sense things that we can do, but if you don't think about it, you get an email that tells you have a UPS package. Click here to track it. And most of us don't even stop to think, do we really have a UPS package? Should we really, click there? I've been getting those every day for the last 6 months. And, UPS didn't work. Then they switched to the Postal Service. And so, we really have to educate ourselves a bit, really to help ourselves. And I think one of the points that we made is you don't even really, if you don't consider yourself an important person, you are, because you may be the way to somebody else. You may be the way into your company. So you really do have to think about that.
We'll take just one more, if there is one out here. Am I missing somebody?
The back.
Sure. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Could you envision something serious enough, like an attack on the missile system, that would cause the internet to be shut down for weeks, months, or even longer?
Well, I tell you what, I'll take the first shot and ask these others along the way. One of the fascinating questions that came up when we revealed, over the objections of the US government, the operation to go after North Korea's missile programs was, did this make this fair game? And would this mean that other states would come after our weapon systems, either to sabotage them or to try to redirect them? And if you feared that was going to happen in wartime, could you imagine the government bringing the internet down rather than leaving it vulnerable? And the fact of the matter is, there's been very little discussion and study of this on a broad basis inside the US government. And it's one of our key vulnerabilities, because the question is, could you spoof the US government into doing far more destruction than an outsider might be able to go do? But we'll ask the two of you.
I think, the challenge is, one, could you actually do it under what powers? And in some ways, just the dependence on it, we just don't understand these days. I think shutting down the internet would be kind of like shutting down the road system in many ways, with regards to our economy, with regards to just the number of devices. I think it's terrifying that we don't even understand what our dependencies are. So I think, we would have so much to lose that it would be very hard to come up with a scenario where taking the entire internet offline, and that'd probably mean the American internet too, right? Like, as Eric Schmidt pointed out, we are starting to almost bifurcate. The Chinese probably aren't going to take down their part of the internet if we take down ours. So, complex question. I really hope not, because I'd miss YouTube, I'd miss Netflix, I don't know.
Well, I would offer, I don't know that you can take down the internet. I personally don't think that's possible. I mean, it's not like there's a switch we can flip and turn everything off. So, and even if we were, I believe if the federal government, the White House, directed the internet to be taken down, I still don't think it would happen. I mean, I just think there's too many moving parts. There's too many people own pieces of the internet. No one owns the entire thing. There's no switch to flip. Don't think it would happen.
It's a fascinating question. Well, thank you both, and appreciate your bringing your expertise to us.